Good evening and welcome to our very first webinar series exploring the clinical psychology application form process. Those that know me will know that I'm not very confident with technology, so moving to more online content and working is a very big deal for me. This pandemic has forced a lot of us to change our ways of working, and certainly for me this has been a big change. For those that don't know me, my name is Lucy Kozlowski and I'm a clinical psychologist who's very passionate about all things psychology, obviously. I work in the NHS across a range of settings, including paediatrics, primary care psychology, community and inpatient services, and I specialise in physical health, particularly long-term health conditions such as stroke, diabetes, chronic pain, fatigue, IBS, obesity and respiratory conditions. And I also work privately under the third wave psychologist, specialising in healthcare staff wellbeing, so including counsellors, psychologists, trainee psychologists, assistant psychologists, psychological therapists, nursing staff, allied health professions, supporting them with their wellbeing. And I also work privately with perinatal mental health patients, so patients who might be pregnant or in the first couple of years postpartum, supporting their well-being and attachment relationships with children, and general well-being as well, stress, anxiety, low mood, anger, self-esteem. So basically I work across a whole range of different settings and with different groups of people, and my main ways of working I tend to ascribe to evolutionary psychology and community psychology principles and ways of working, which basically means that I'm interested in how the world around us affects our well-being, so things like political structures and acts, socioeconomic factors, our physical environment, and how all of these factors affect our well-being and physical health. And I also use third wave CBT approaches, hence the name of my private work, third wave psychologist, and I mainly draw from ACT approaches, acceptance and commitment therapy, compassionate mind and mindfulness approaches in this work. And in my roles over the years, I've supervised many assistant psychologists who are looking to develop into clinical psychologists. And it's around this time of year that lots of anxiety comes up, lots of questions come up related to the application process for clinical training. So I thought it would be useful just to put together some tips based on experiences from my colleagues, from myself, from reviewers of the form, from other psychologists, some basic top tips for enhancing application forms and getting the most out of them. Just a couple of disclaimers before we get started. So this is not a guaranteed foolproof method of getting an interview. I wish I could give you all the magic answers, but unfortunately there isn't any. These are just our top tips based on the experiences I outlined previously. And each course is very different. I think that's important to remember. Each course uses different scoring or rating criteria, or they adopt different ethoses or different approaches. So there's no standard approach for all of the courses. I think the most important thing to do is look at the different courses you're thinking of applying to, look at their ethos, look at the approaches they subscribe to, whether they're more CBT orientated or systemic orientated, or adopt more community psychology ways of working, and see what fits for you and make sure that your form speaks to that. And reviewers will all be very subjective as well, so they will come from their own backgrounds. So what one reviewer might look for, another reviewer might look for something slightly different. So unfortunately there's no systematic tick box exercise that we can work through, but it's just thinking about how you can communicate in the form, who you are, what your hopes are from training, and how this maps onto the university you're thinking of applying to, plus making sure that we make the most of the spaces in each of the sections on the form. So hopefully that's what you're looking for today. So let's just start with an overview of what we're going to cover today. So we'll start with just thinking about the form itself. General overview of the form. Some of you may have applied before, may be familiar with it, some of you may not. We'll think about some general points to consider as you work through the form, and we'll think about the key sections that we can go through in a bit more detail. I'm not going to cover all of the sections on the form because obviously some of them speak to themselves. I can't talk about your qualifications and your personal interests, but we'll just cover some of the key sections that assistants generally ask me to look over and think about when they're applying. And then finally, but most importantly, we'll think about your personal self-care throughout this process, as this is just as important as the rest of the form, and going through this process is challenging. It's a challenging time of the year, and I've certainly seen on social media that anxiety levels are already quite high at the moment. And I know from personal experience that this time of year evokes a lot of emotions, and it certainly still does for me. Even many, many years later, I still get those feelings around this time of year. Maybe it's the seasonal triggers that sort of promote those memories, but certainly remember the anxiety and the difficult thoughts and feelings that came up when the application process opened. So don't underestimate the importance of your own well-being and self-care throughout this process. So let's have a look at the application form. So I've just screenshotted the main aspects of the application form that you will go through online with Clearinghouse. So you may be familiar with the form, but we will go through each area in more detail. But just to pick out a few areas that I'm not going to go through in more detail. So I get asked a lot about references, and who's best to ask, who can I use. I've been asked to be a referee for people that I don't really know before, so I think it's important just to mention a couple of things here. It's important to ask someone who knows you. As I said, I get asked to do references for people I barely know, and I can't speak to that person's skills and their suitability for a career in clinical psychology, so it wouldn't be fair to them to do a reference. So ideally you need to ask somebody who knows you well, and ideally who is a clinical psychologist, of course, but I appreciate that not everybody will have that option. So ideally ask your supervisor who knows you best, your clinical supervisor who can share your skills, share the skills that relate to being a clinical psychologist, your strengths, your abilities, your capabilities, and who can speak to those openly and honestly. So basically choose someone who knows you well, and if this person is a clinical psychologist, great, that's even better. But you know, try and get that balance between someone who knows you and who knows the profession and the duties and the responsibilities and the skills of a clinical psychologist. And also just to mention course centres, which I've briefly mentioned, but it's worth familiarising yourself with the different courses and their ethos, their beliefs, their approaches that they subscribe to. I know lots of people apply to courses based on locality, and that's fine, and I certainly did that. Because lots of people don't have the luxury of being able to move. Some people have families, mortgages. It's not easy to upend your life. So, you know, it's not the end of the world if you have to apply somewhere based on locality. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the form reflects your beliefs, of course, and your passions and your ways of wanting to work, but also reflects the course's beliefs and passions to show that you're a good fit for that university and that course. You may not have a preference or idea about the ways that you want to work, which is fine. Absolutely, that's what training's for, to get a variety of training experiences, and you might find an area you want to specialise in during the course. You might already have an idea and be fixed in that. Again, that's okay. Just be mindful when applying that you're not singing to the wrong hymn sheet, if you like. So my advice would be, if you've got the luxury of being flexible on location, read around each of the courses and see which ones fit with your ways of working and which ones speak best to you, and apply based on that rather than location. And if you can't, that's fine. If you're stuck on location, that's absolutely fine. Just think about what that course wants and can you speak to that and not appear too drastically different from the course. So thinking about some of the key points as you go through the form, some general top tips would be: use each section well and wisely. Make sure that you answer the question that's asked of you. So I will see lots of examples of each section being used to convey points that could easily be popped in another section to save on word count. So I know this sounds obvious and simple, But time and time again, I do read forms where applicants have not answered the question, or they've answered the question in the wrong box or the wrong section. So ensure your answer speaks to the question and doesn't just showcase skills and experience for the sake of it, or doesn't repeat itself from another section, and make the point clearly and succinctly, and then move on. Use your peers and supervisors or qualified psychologists if that's possible and you have access to a qualified psychologist, and of course if they're willing. Do seek support from others in this respect. You know, get people to review your form. Another set of eyes on it can be really, really useful, just to spot any sort of examples where perhaps you've been repeating yourself, or thinking about ways that you're not answering the question, or that you're not being succinct enough. Another set of eyes can spot that and help you to tailor that. And that's okay. I know lots of people feel uncomfortable about asking for help, or think they shouldn't, or think this should reflect them. Absolutely, of course it should. But one of the criteria that reviewers will be looking for is that you have had support and supervision from psychologists and an overview. And actually it goes for you rather than against you if you have been having that kind of supervision, because it will show in the statement. The personal statement, again, don't underestimate the importance of the other sections. So when people ask me to look at their form, they only ever send over the personal statement, the first question in that personal statement section, the, you know, in what way have your experiences made you ready for training? Yes, that's a very important section, but so are the other important, the other sections, and they should all speak to each other, they should all flow, and they should all complement each other. So I will always ask the assistant or the applicant to send me all of the sections, to make sure that each section is used well and wisely. And I think the fact that people call it the personal statement then confuses how they answer that question. So we'll come on to that shortly, but absolutely, I can't emphasize this enough. Don't underestimate the importance of the other sections. And of course, make it personal, make the form personal, show your passions, your interests, who you are, and own your position. Use the social graces, if you're familiar with them, which speak to sort of social aspects of ourselves, our gender, our race, our age, culture, ethnicity, educational status, social status, socioeconomic status. There's a whole range of different social aspects that the social graces speak to. So have a look at those, research those, and see which ones you connect with. And, you know, showcase your clinical interests. What areas are you passionate about? Are you passionate about psychosis? Are you passionate about autism? Are you passionate about physical health, mental health? And what are your research passions? What would you like to get from training, and what can you deliver back to communities, to patients, to clients? What do you care about, so that we can see you in the form? And I think that's really important. So starting with the experience section, so what I call the CV section. This is essentially your CV. It's your opportunity to showcase your experience, your huge range of experience, or, you know, whatever experience that you have. I know lots of people feel very daunted by this section because they feel like they need to showcase lots and lots of experience that they have acquired, and that is important. But I think even if you've had 1 or 2 roles, you want to showcase all the duties and responsibilities that you've held, that you've delivered in that role. All of the skills you're learning, all of the duties you're performing, they're all important, and think about, you know, those transferable skills. So you want to showcase a wide range of experience within each role that you've held. So ask yourself, what skills and duties do I perform on a daily basis, and how do these map onto the job description of a trainee clinical psychologist? You want to think about making that clear. You want to think about making that concise. You want to make it obvious that you have acquired experience that fits onto that role of a clinical psychologist. So this is the place to basically showcase what skills you have, what duties you've performed, what responsibilities you've had. And you can bullet point these. You know, I see again a lot of long-winded sentences about the experience and summarising it, but absolutely you want to showcase everything that you've done. So whether that's service development, whether that's undertaking research, whether that's leadership experiences, clinical experiences, assessment experiences, engagement and liaison with other professions, MDT working, so multidisciplinary team working, inter-service working, between service work. You want to showcase a whole range of skills that speak to the role of the clinical psychologist. And don't dismiss non-related experience as well. So in the other experience section, consider other roles you may have held, for example, from different professions, so hospitality sectors or sales sectors or IT or different sectors. There's lots of transferable skills and duties from non-related work that I'm sure you will have developed from those roles. So things like computer skills, professional engagement, time management skills, organisational skills, self-management skills. So showcase and emphasise these and reflect on them. Show you're always reflecting and learning and developing, and show that you're able to develop skills that are transferable and you recognise these transferable skills. So I've just popped a couple of position examples up that we commonly see on the forms. So the role of senior assistant psychologist. So you want to be clear, concise in these examples, detail the duties performed, as say, make sure they map onto the role of a clinical psychology trainee, and showcase a range of different roles and responsibilities. So this was a couple of examples from my forms. So a couple of positions I held, so senior assistant psychologist, long-term conditions lead, deliver CBT and ACT-based interventions, research and audit, service development and promotion, deliver training, management and supervision of assistant psychologists. So very clear, very succinct. This is what my day-to-day duties look like. Very clear what each duty was, very brief, and showcases a range of skills that are on the job description and the person's specification of a trainee assistant psychologist. And neuropsychological support worker, my first ever clinical role. I facilitated carers groups, support groups and systemic psychoeducational sessions, implemented executive skills tasks and cognitive retention training, provided psychosocial, emotional and occupational support. So think about the language used here. So consider using psychological language and terms. So a good piece of advice that was given to me by my supervisor at the time was that I think my initial example before she reviewed the form was something like engaged with carers and clients, or emotional support or something like that. And her advice was make these terms more psychological. Think about the duties listed on the job specification, how your duties map onto these, and make them easy for the reviewer to access and see, tick off and say, yes, they've performed that duty, yes, they performed that duty in psychological terms. And that was really useful for me in thinking about the other roles that I've held, healthcare assistant, research assistant, just to get those key duties bullet pointed in the form so they can all be ticked off. Yes, she's covered those skills. Yes, she's performed those duties. So moving on to the personal statement section. For ease, I will refer to the first question, the personal statement, asking how have your experiences made you a better candidate for training in clinical psychology, just for ease, and I know lots of people refer to it as the personal statement, so that's how I will refer to it. But there are 3 other statements in this section, and it's really important not to neglect these or underestimate their importance. And I think that, as I say, that using it or referring to it as the personal statement adds to the confusion, stops people from answering the question that's asked of them. So with the personal statement, I know I keep repeating this, but I cannot emphasize it enough. Answer the question, which is, how have your experiences made you a better candidate for training? So this question is asking how the experiences you've listed in your CV section have made you a better candidate for training, or put it another way, how have your experiences made you ready for training? So the reviewer will know all about your experience from the CV section, which is great. What they want to know now is, what have you learned from this experience? So think transferable skills, think reflections, think You know, how are you developing as a clinician, and how are you developing as a clinical psychologist? So they want to know what skills you've developed and what your reflections are on these, what you've learned from your experience so far. How does this experience map onto the role of a clinical psychology trainee, and how has it prepared you to take the next step in your development? So link the two together, your experience, your duties that you performed, your roles and the skills, and then link that to your reflections. What have you learned from your experience? What have you gained as a result of the experiences that you've had in your CV section? What skills and what knowledge have you learned? What have you taken away from these experiences? What will you take forward as a trainee from these experiences? And how has your experience prepared you to undertake the duties of the job description and the person specification? And it's really important here to think about the whole role of the clinical psychologist. So have an overview of the role clear in your mind, have an overview of the different areas and aspects of it clear in your mind. Have the job spec in front of you, or the job description. It's a diverse job with many roles, lots of facets to it. And again, another common mistake that I will see over and over is that therapy or direct clinical work is spoken very much to in the form, which is lovely and great, and there's lots of great reflections on this. But it's really important not to neglect the non-direct clinical work and the other non-clinical elements of the role, such as supervision, consultancy, service development, research. And I know that lots of assistants feel they don't have the opportunity to undertake those sort of roles or those duties, but just have a think, even in small ways, that you've begun building skills in each of these areas, and reflect on these. And it might just be conversations with MDT colleagues, multidisciplinary colleagues. It might be delivering a brief training. It might be peer support. It could be delivering training at a team meeting. Just to start thinking about ways that you're sharing psychological knowledge with others, way that you're leading others and promoting psychological thinking in others. Think about ways that you've perhaps advised others in a psychological approach, even small conversations, and just showcase that you're beginning to build these skills. Remember, you're not applying to be a clinical psychologist, you're applying to be a trainee clinical psychologist. So we're not expecting you to be qualified and competent in these skills. It's just showing ways that you're starting to develop these skills, and thinking about ways that you're aware that these are the skills and the roles of the clinical psychologist. So showing an awareness that it's not just about delivering therapy, which is obviously part of the role, but it's also about the wider aspects of the role. Another common area I see neglected in forms is to think about the scientist practitioner model underlying training programs and the role of the clinical psychologist. So it's important to speak to this, speak to what it means to being a scientist practitioner in your assistant roles. How do you use theory, evidence, policy to inform your practice? How do you contribute to evidence in your practice? And consider the challenges of working in this way as well. So what are the challenges to working as a scientist practitioner in the modern NHS, and contextualize this, contextualize the role of the clinical psychologist in the NHS within a political system, and also within the current climate. I'm sure you're all aware of coronavirus and the impact this is having on day-to-day duties. So certainly contextualize the role and bring in these wider social factors and think about those. And also contextualize you, your life, your experience, your culture, and your sexuality. Essentially, do not consider the role and your experiences in isolation. Make sure that you contextualize these. Consider the wider systemic influences on the role, and vice versa, how the role influences the system in which we operate. As I say, I work as a community psychologist, or I try to, and it's really important to consider the role within the NHS, within politically funded services, And within societal events such as COVID, what are the challenges and strengths of the role? What does it offer? How is it affected by these factors? What works, what doesn't? And be open about challenges, not defeatist, but open about them. Think about skills or duties, or reflect on how you've overcome perhaps challenges in your work. And consider the wider influences on you and your journey. What does your personal culture, family background, ethnicity, colour, sexuality, what does this bring to the table? How has this influenced your workplace experiences and your suitability for training? I feel it's a discredit to our profession that people from certain backgrounds are woefully underrepresented in our profession. And it's okay to own that position. It's okay to have your position. I've certainly had assistants who identify from LGBT communities, and they've asked me if it's okay to include their experiences or their personal information on the form, and of course it is. I've been moved to tears by their forms, and I really want our profession to do better for them, for all those that have been marginalised. And I think this, I really feel this has to start within our own profession. And I do believe that our understandings of ourselves cannot be removed from the social and political and cultural systems that surround us. For me, many of the dominant psychological models in practice at the moment exclude these factors, and this is something I believe psychology as a whole needs to address. But it's certainly one of the strengths of clinical psychology, in particular over recent years. I'm aware many of my BAME colleagues and colleagues from other minority groups don't necessarily subscribe to Western values and cultural norms that psychology and psychological models largely adopt. And these can be real barriers, not just for my colleagues, but for the communities that we work with. And there are many groups in society that bring a wealth of different knowledge and different realities and experiences to the table. And these are often marginalised, including by our own profession. And that can be really difficult to sit with. And I know that many groups face many obstacles. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation to address this and start thinking about how we tackle these wider systemic issues. But I think it's important to acknowledge them. And it's not to say that they shouldn't and won't be discussed. There's certainly lots of online content at the moment for BAME groups. And I've got the links to them on our social media platforms, but I think it's important to acknowledge that change needs to happen. But I think it's also important in the context of this personal statement to remember that it's a reflective piece. And yes, the criticisms are totally valid. It's important to get a balance between not tearing the profession to pieces, but reflecting on the issues and the barriers. And the intersection with your professional life is important to absolutely acknowledge. So, structuring the personal statement. I know that many assistants or those applying are worried about the word count, have so much to say and want to showcase so much experience and knowledge and skills, but there's so little space. So this is something we'll think a bit more about because this is really important. Another consideration of reviewers is that it's really important that the applicant is concise, clear and succinct. So if you think reviewers are reviewing several forms in the day and you want to make your key points stand out, you want to make the key points accessible, you want to make them clear. So you want to think about the point you want to get across and then practice over and over trying to reduce this to a succinct short sentence that conveys your message and your key key point, if you like. So you want it to be organised as well, so that it flows, and again, just be mindful of abbreviations. So again, I've reviewed forms where perhaps people have used abbreviations that I'm not familiar with, so I'm not clear on the point they're making. There's a couple of abbreviations that are probably okay, like CBT or MDT, but I would always err on the side of caution, and if you're going to use abbreviations, spell out the word first and then abbreviate. But yeah, there's a few words that I'm sure would be fine abbreviating. And think about the complete role of the psychologist. So when you're writing the form, you want to make it as organised and structured as possible. So you don't want to jump from point to point. Think about the areas, the duties of a clinical psychologist, and speak coherently to these. Use sections if you wish, or use headers. That's absolutely fine. You just want to make it easy to read, punchy, and to the point, so the reviewer can tick off each key point as they go and make those key points clear, ready, and accessible for the reviewer. Remember, they'll be reading so many forms, so you want yours to be clear and accessible. So thinking about this in a bit more detail, thinking about how you can improve the word count or the character count. Think about how you're using that section. So as I say, you don't want to speak to the CV section here, because you've already showcased your experience, the fact that you've performed those duties before. So a common example I will see is that applicants will showcase experience and really want to get across, you know, the experience they've had, how experienced they are in the personal statement. But that's what the CV is for. So in this example, the applicant is outlined a load of duties that they performed, but it's not quite answering the question. So it's using 324 characters to say what they've already done. It's not saying, how am I ready for training? How am I prepared for training? So as you can see here, so the example outlines setting up an ASC diagnosis clinic and the range of duties that they performed in doing that. But this could all be documented in the CV section. So think about, ask yourself, what are the key skills? What duties am I performing daily? So these are all succinct and they are all showcased here. So all these can be documented in the CV section: clinical resources development, auditing, database management, service evaluation, IT system management, evidence-based interventions, and report writing. Those could all be bulleted in the CV section, which then reduces the word count by 324. What the question is asking is how these experiences have made you ready for training. So what you're actually looking to answer is what your reflections on these duties are. So for example, through setting up an ASC clinic, that's fine. I learned X, Y, Z. I needed these skills. I needed to perform in this way. These challenges became apparent. This is how I managed these challenges. These are the skills that I use to perform this role effectively, and these are the skills that I will take forward onto training. That's basically what you're trying to say here. And making sure that the skills that are already clearly documented in the CV section, so you can speak to what you learned from these skills in the personal statement. Again, another sort of common issue that I see is wordy statements or sentences. Ask yourself, what is the key point you're trying to make here? What are you trying to say? And then think about how you can significantly reduce that sentence. So a very wordy example here: supervision has helped me view my work as a reflective learning process and has given me the space to explore my own emotional responses. I've noticed a tendency to want to rescue people, but now realise the importance of working in the remit of my role and treating therapy heuristically. So I see these sentences over and over again in forms. It's fine, they're valid reflections, but think, what am I speaking to here? What is the key skill that I'm speaking to here? What's my key point here? So to summarise, the 4 key points that I took out of this long sentence was use of supervision, excellent, of course that needs to be in here. Reflective practice, excellent. Self-awareness, being aware of your own emotional and cognitive responses, your own inner experience, and self-management of these. So those are the sort of 4 key points that I took from that. And then by reducing that sentence to using supervision to reflect on my inner processes has enhanced my self-awareness and self-management skills, you're saying exactly the same thing, but the key points are there, they're clear, they're succinct, and also your word count is now 1/3 of what it was before. So it's just getting those very clear key skills in the sentence and making them very obvious. Some more condensing examples. So I identified an opportunity, a need to develop a new group for young women with AFC to improve social skills and increase social interaction as part of their post-diagnostic support. I identified a clinical need. That's all you need to say there. So again, I see lots of examples popped into the sentences that are not needed. So you're thinking about transferable skills here. You don't want to necessarily showcase specific examples of practice or skills or duties or roles or responsibilities that you performed here, because you're not going to be working with that specific group only. You're going to be working with children, adolescents, young adults, older adults, babies, parents, families in different settings. So you're not applying to a specific role, you're applying to a training course. So we're looking at transferable skills and what you're taking away from your roles. So you don't need to provide specific examples. That's what, again, the CV section is for. It's just really important to show the transferable skills that you've developed from that. So I identified a clinical need. How did you address that? So for example, I identified a clinical need, took it to supervision, just to showcase the specific skill and being very clear with that. I value a transparent approach as a clinician when working with clients who find it difficult to engage. Transparent, again, this is a way that you can reduce sort of not needed words. So again, I see lots of excessive words in sentences that just are not needed to be there. So transparency has been important to engage difficult to reach clients. Again, reduces the word count or character count significantly, but still says the same thing. Again, don't need to give specific examples. There's lots of clients that we will work with who are challenging or will be difficult to engage with. So don't need to highlight each specific group that you've worked with. And again, that should be evident in the CV section. And the third example, again, is an example of unnecessary examples included in the sentence. I've increased my knowledge of developing psychological formulations to inform therapy that is appropriate for each client. For example, when working systemically with LD clients using a cross-sectional formulation. So basically, this is a very wordy, waffly sentence that is essentially saying, I've used tailored psychological formulation to inform therapy. So again, don't need to include unnecessary examples because that's in the CV section and not needed. You just need to showcase the specific skill and what you've learned from that. So the use of psychological formulation to inform therapy, maybe you don't even need to include tailored because each psychological formulation will be tailored, but you know, it's an option. So my key, I guess, reflections on the personal statement are: make sure you answer the question that it's asking. I cannot repeat this enough. Answer the question. Don't use it as an opportunity to showcase your CV, because that is what the CV section is for. And don't use it to list and describe your experiences and skills and duty. Reflect on these experiences, skills and duties. What are you learning from them? What skills are you developing? What are the challenges? How do you overcome them? What are the barriers to working in this way? Speak to the scientist practitioner model. Don't neglect that. And contextualized. Don't ignore the context that psychologists work in. And of course, you'll be training as an NHS member of staff. So you want to acknowledge the NHS systems and teams that you'll be working within and the political systems in which we work. We cannot neglect those. And be as succinct, clear and concise in your sentences as possible. Don't waffle, don't repeat yourself, don't add in extra words that are not needed. Just be very clear, succinct and to the point. So moving on from that very challenging section to publications and disseminations. So here I see lots of applications that have this box empty, and it is hard to get access to research, or being able to undertake research can be quite limited in the NHS. Of course, that's, you know, lots of people experience those challenges, but it's important to also share any times that you've shared your work here. So it might be publications, it might be research papers, it might be chapters or books. You know, lots of applicants have those experiences, but lots of applicants don't. So think about any times that you've shared any work that you've undertaken, whether that's in team meetings or department meetings, or whether it's with your peers. Have you developed any self-help resources that you've shared with the wider public or with clients, handouts? What work have you developed and how have you shared that, and who have you shared it with? Think about that. So that might be something that you can add into that section. But I do appreciate it can be challenging for lots of assistants to acquire that research experience that they want. Hopes from training. So question 3. So what are your hopes from training? So obviously I can't speak to what you want to get out of training. That's a very personal journey. But it's really important to think about you and what you're looking for from a training course. I know a lot of people feel that pressure that they have to fit in, and of course you do want to ideally, you know, align with the course values, but it's important to show you and your personal interests, as I said earlier, your clinical interests, your research interests, and what areas do you want to develop personally. You know, is it important to you to develop as a community psychologist, as a systemic therapist, as a CBT therapist? What are your interests, but also the other aspects of the role. Again, don't neglect those. Think about the complete role of the clinical psychologist. So delivering supervision, consultancy, service development, leadership. Think about the wider role in general, and speak to that as well. Again, another common issue that I see in this section is that people speak widely to the clinical aspects of the role but neglect the wider role. So what the reviewer is looking for is that you understand the complete role of the clinical psychologist, that you're not looking to train as a psychological therapist, but you're also looking to train as an all-round psychologist. And again, think about the context. Important to acknowledge the NHS in this section, your hopes from training to be a clinical psychologist in the NHS. So you will be trained in the NHS, and ideally post-training, they would like you to work in the NHS. The NHS is investing a lot of money in the profession. So it's thinking about what the NHS needs from you as a clinical psychologist. What skills do you want to develop that help you to be a clinical psychologist within the NHS? And what you want to give back as a psychologist, whether that's to the NHS or wider communities. And of course, the About You section is about you, so I can't really answer that, but who are you? That's important to share here. So those are the main sections really of the form. So hopefully that's given you an overview of things to think about specifically when answering those questions. And of course there are other sections to the form. So, you know, do have a think about how you can best make use of those. As I say, I think it's important to acknowledge our self-care as well. Most importantly in all of this, look after you. Rejection is tough, and if you've already experienced rejection, and lots of people have several times, so it took me 3 years to get onto the course, which I think is about the average. I know lots of people who have tried several years and have still not acquired a place, which is very sad because they're more than capable, more than good enough to undertake the course. It's literally a numbers game. And I know that doesn't help to hear, and people probably tell you this over and over. And of course, everybody who applies is more than competent and more than good enough. But certainly you can still take rejection very personally, and we can always ask ourselves, what am I doing wrong? Especially if you work in a service where there are other assistants and they gain places. It can be really tough and really hard on our self-esteem and on our confidence. It can certainly knock our well-being, and I know for me it was a very challenging journey. So just be aware of what's going on inside you and respond to this. Listen to your thoughts and feelings, and respond effectively, respond to your needs. Again, showing good self-management, self-care. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What do I need? Practice what you preach. Make sure you draw on your personal coping skills. What lifts you up? What keeps you going? And just be kind to yourself. Practice self-compassion, self-kindness. And with the assistants that I work with, I encourage them to, you know, adopt an ACT approach. I think one thing that we can get lost in with clinical, and certainly I did, was seeing clinical as the end goal. It's easy to get caught up in seeing clinical psychology as that end goal, but I think it's important to ask yourself, what are your values driving this career path? Why do you want to do this? What are your personal values? Which ones do you connect with? And how are you living aligned to these values already? Whether that's in your current role, your day-to-day life, how do your day-to-day experiences reflect these values already? And how are you already being, a helpful or supportive or creative practitioner, and not seeing it as that end goal and living your life defined by that end goal, but actually you're already living aligned to those values. So try and separate your values from your actions and end goals. Try and find a way that you can connect with meaningful day-to-day acts that you're performing. It may be that clinical psychology is what you want to do, but who do you want to be and how are you already living aligned to that? So separate your goals basically from your values is what I'm saying, and separate who you want to be from what you want to be. So that's, I guess, the end of the webinar. So thank you for sticking with us, and I hope it was useful for you. We will be running other webinars in this Applying to Clinical Psychology service, including practicing self-care, preparing for the interview, and the role of the clinical psychologist. And there's also another webinar that we'll be running, Act Mindfully, starting with Act for Self-Care. And the Act Mindfully series will be an opportunity to learn more about ACT and mindfulness and practice this in your own personal life, and help you to think about ways to build on these self-care skills that I mentioned. But keep in touch. So following this, there will be a live Q&A on the Clinical Psychology Applicant Support Group on the Third Wave Psychologist Facebook page. And do follow us on social media for more tips and daily insights. I'm happy to answer any questions, so please do keep in touch. I'm happy to share support and encouragement. And I certainly want to share in your success as well, or support you in your disappointment. I appreciate not everybody's going to get an interview or get a place. So we're here to encourage you and to help you to keep trying and moving forward in line with your values. So please do keep in touch, and hopefully speak with you soon.